They came to the school for me and took me home, and I explained to mother that I was going with you to look at a place we were going to move to. I put on the potatoes and put the meat in the oven, and mother is going to tell George just what to do to finish supper when he gets home," she exclaimed eagerly. "And oh, isn't it lovely?" "Indeed it is lovely," said Shirley, her face flushing with pleasure, and her eyes speaking gratitude to the young man in the front seat who was opening the door for her to step in beside him. That was a wonderful ride. The spring had made tremendous advances in her work during the 10 days since they went that way before. The flush of green that the willows had worn had become a soft, bright feather of foliage, and the maples had sent out crimson tassels to offset them. Down in the meadows and along the roadside the grass was thick and green, and the bare brown fields had disappeared. Little brooks sang tinklingly as they glided under bridges, and the birds darted here and there in busy, noisy pairs. Frail, wavering blossoms starred the swampy places, and the air was sweet with scents of living things. But when they came in sight of the barn, Elizabeth and her brother grew silent, from sheer desire to talk and not act as if there were anything different about it. Now that they had actually brought Shirley here, the new windows seemed fairly to flaunt themselves in their shining, mossy paint and their vast extent of diamond panes, so that the two conspirators were deeply embarrassed, and dared not face what they had done. It was Carol who broke the silence that had come upon them all. "Oh, oh, oh!" she shouted. "Shirley, just look! New, great big windows! Isn't that great? Now you needn't worry whether it will be dark for mother days when she can't go out. Isn't that the best ever?" But Shirley looked, and her cheeks grew pink as her eyes grew starry. She opened her lips to speak and then closed them again, for the words would not come, and the tears came instead, but she drove them back and then managed to say, "Oh, Mr. Graham! Oh, you have gone to so much trouble!" "No, no trouble at all," he said almost crossly, for he had wanted her not to notice those windows, at least not yet. "You see, it was this way. The windows were some that were left over from another order, and I got a chance to get them at a bargain. I thought they might as well be put in now as any time, and you get the benefit of them. The barn really needed more light. It was a very dark barn indeed. Hadn't you noticed it? I can't see how my grandfather thought it would do to have so little light and air. But you know in the old times they didn't used to have such advanced ideas about ventilation and germs and things." He felt he was getting on rather famously until he looked down at the clear eyes of the girl and knew she was seeing right straight through all his talk. However, she hadn't the face to tell him so, and so he boldly held on his way, making up fine stories about things that barns needed until he all but believed them himself, and when he got through he need only to finish with, "And if it isn't so, it ought to be," to have a regular water baby argument out of it. He managed to talk on in this vein until he could stop the car and help Shirley out, and together they all went up the now velvety green of the incline to the big door. "It is beautiful, beautiful!" murmured Shirley in a daze of delight. She could not yet make it seem real that she was to come to this charmed spot to live in a few days. Graham unlocked the big doors and sent them rolling back with a touch, showing what ball bearings and careful workmanship can do. The group stepped inside and stood to look again. The setting sun was casting a red glow through the diamond panes and over the wide floor. The new partitions, guiltless of paint, for Graham had not dared to go further, were mellowed into ruby hangings. The stone fireplace rose at the opposite side of the room, and the new staircase was just at the side, all in the ruddy evening glow that carried rich, dusky shadows into the corners and hung a curtain of vagueness over blemishes. Then, all suddenly, before they had had time to take in the changes, more than the fact of the partitions which they expected, Graham stepped to the side of the door and touched a button, and behold, a myriad of lights burst forth about the place, making it bright like noontime. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" breathed Carol in awe and wonder, and "Oh!" again, as if there were nothing else to say. But Shirley only looked and caught her breath. It seemed a palace too fine for their poor little means, and a sudden fear gripped hold upon her. "Oh, Mr. Graham, you have done too much!" she choked. "You shouldn't have done it. We can never afford to pay for all of this." "Not at all," said young Graham quickly. "This isn't anything. The electric people gave permission for this, and I thought it would be safer than lamps and candles, you know. It cost scarcely anything for the wiring. I had our regular man do it that attends to the wiring and lights at the office. It was a mere trifle and will make things a lot more convenient for you. You see, it's nothing to the company. They just gave permission for a wire to be run from the pole there. Of course, they might not do it for everyone, but I've some pretty good friends in the company, so it's all right." " But the fireplace," said Shirley, going over to look at it. " It's beautiful. It's like what you see in magazine pictures of beautiful houses." " Why, it was just the stones that were left from cutting the windows larger. I thought they might as well be utilized, you know. It wasn't much more work to pile them up that way while the men were here than if we had had them carted away." Here Carol interrupted. " Shirley, there's a telephone, a real telephone !" Shirley's accusing eyes were upon her landlord. " It was put in for our convenience while the workmen were here," he explained defensively. " It is a pay phone, you see, and is no expense except when in use. It can be taken out if you do not care to have it, of course, but it occurred to me since it was here your mother might feel more comfortable out here all day if she could call you when she needed to." Shirley's face was a picture of varying emotions as she listened, but relief and gratitude conquered as she turned to him. " I believe you have thought of everything," she said at last. " I have worried about that all this week. I have wondered if mother would be afraid out in the country with only the children, and the neighbors not quite near enough to call. But this solves the difficulty. You are sure it hasn't cost you a lot to have this put in?" " Why, don't you know the telephone company is glad to have their phones wherever they can get them?" he evaded. " Now don't worry about anything more. You'll find hardships enough living in a barn without fretting about the few conveniences we have been able to manage." " But this is real luxury," she said, sitting down on the steps and looking up where the lights blazed from the loft. " You have put lights up there, too, and a railing. I was so afraid Doris would fall down sometime." " I am glad to find you are human after all, and have a few fears," declared the owner, laughing. " I had begun to think you were Spartan through and through, and weren't afraid of anything. Yes, I had the men put what lumber they had left into that railing. I thought it wasn't safe to have it all open like that, and I didn't want you to sue me for life or limb, you know. There's one thing I haven't managed yet, and that is piping water up from the spring. I haven't been able to get hold of the right man so far, but he's coming out to morrow, and I hope it can be done. There is a spring on the hill back of us, and I believe it is high enough to get the water to this floor. If it is, it will make your work much easier and be only the matter of a few rods of pipe." " Oh, but indeed you mustn't do anything more," pleaded Shirley. " I shall feel so ashamed paying such a little rent." " But, my dear young lady," said Graham in his most dignified business manner, " you don't at all realize how much lower rents are in the country, isolated like this, than they are in the city. And you haven't as yet realized what a lot of inconveniences you will have to put up with. When you go back to the city in the winter you will be glad to get away from here." " Never !" said Shirley fervently, and shuddered. " Oh, never ! You don't know how dreadful it seems that we shall have to go back. But of course I suppose we shall. One couldn't live in a barn in the winter, even though it is a palace for the summer." And she looked about wistfully. Then, her eyes lighting up, she said in a low tone for the young man's benefit alone, " I think God must have made you do all this for us." She turned and walked swiftly over to one of the new casement windows, looking out at the red glow that the sun in sinking had left in the sky, and there against the fringes of the willows and maples shone out the bright weather vane on the spire of the little white church in the valley. " I think God must have sent you to teach me and my little sister a few things," said a low voice just behind Shirley, as she struggled with tired, happy tears that would blur her eyes. But when she turned to smile at the owner of the voice he was walking over by the door and talking to Carol. They tumbled joyously into the car very soon, and sped on their way to the city again. That night the Hollister children told their mother they had found a place in which to live. CHAPTER X